what's remarkable about this story, truly remarkable, is that in 2021, according to a retired civil servant who was very senior in the Department of Education at the time, in fact, he essentially ran the Department of Education for 4 years until the middle of 2020, it was Rishi Sunak's express decision to starve these schools of the funding needed for rebuilding. In fact, and this is a rare intervention from Jonathan Slater, the permanent secretary at the DFE from 2016 to 2020. They went to him telling him they needed more money to rebuild schools, and he responded by cutting the repair budgets even further than they had been cut already. And he has gone on the record today to accuse ministers of a political decision to prioritise new free schools over repairing dangerous buildings. Once again, the fetishisation of the free market causes, well, it has consequences, sadly, beyond the pages of the Daily Telegraph or the denizens of Tufton Street. This is what happens when you prioritise a sort of bogus ideology or a fetishisation of free market values over political reality. Incredibly, all roads lead to the same place at the moment, because this is, I mean, I warned you on Friday, I was worried that I was beginning to sound like the kid in The Sixth Sense. But guess who got rid of this chap from the Department of Education in 2020 when he got in at Downing Street? Someone who was previously working at the Department for Education, a chap you've probably heard of called Dominic Cummings. So the civil servants responsible for running the Department for Education go to the Chancellor of the Exchequer and say, we need more money to repair schools, not least because of the autoclaved aerated concrete crisis that is already unfolding, and that has led to the abrupt closure and disruption of more than 100 schools days before the new term starts today. And he turned around and said no. Not only did he turn around and say no, but when officials said they need 300 to 400 schools a year to be rebuilt, and complained that ministers only agreed to fund 100 a year, he said they came back and made the situation even worse. We weren't just saying there's a significant risk of fatality. We were saying there's a critical risk to life if this programme is not funded. Labour already accusing Rishi Sunak of putting children's lives at risk. It's a remarkable moment. We will, I promise you, move towards a phone-in a minute, but I just want to get all the facts in front of you because, well, so few people bother trying these days. Here is. I mean, the sort of. I'll have a little look in Idiot's Corner in a minute. Here are the facts of the matter. Officials recommended that 300 to 400 schools a year needed to be rebuilt. Right. The head of the department said we knew what was needed. We knew that a proper school rebuilding programme was going to be required. Otherwise, these sorts of panics would take place. Right. Point number 2. Michael Gove cancelled Labour's schools rebuilding programme. I think that's even what it was called. It passed the Ronseal test, rebuilding schools programme. Michael Gove, it was one of the first things he did when he got into the Department of Education in 2010, of course, joined by, altogether now, Dominic Cummings. One of the first things he did was to abandon Labour's schools building programme, leaving precisely these problems on the horizon. As the problems hoved ever closer, the civil servants went to ministers and indeed to the then Chancellor, a chap you've probably heard of, Rishi Sunak, and said we need to rebuild 300 to 400 schools a year. And they turned around and said, no, you can have 100. We'll fund 100 a year. And we weren't, this is the crucial line, I think, we weren't just saying there's a significant risk of fatality. We were saying there's a critical risk to life if this programme is not funded. Here it comes. While I was the permanent secretary, in 2018, a concrete block fell from the roof of a primary school. So it wasn't just a risk, it was actually starting to happen. And asked why? Education secretaries, successive education secretaries had been aware of the problem but done nothing about it. Jonathan Slater responded, the top political priority in respect of school building when I was the permanent secretary was in opening new free schools. So there it is. Here's our first entrant into Idiot's Corner of the day. This is David in Gloucestershire. James O'Brien, you are a Class 1 idiot. You really are. What a fool. This concrete has been going on for over 50 years, and it is not on Rishi Sunak. This has been Labour, Conservative, everybody. What an idiot you really are. So David's in Idiot's Corner because he is unaware of the fact that the man who was running the Department of Education, as this problem's urgency became clear, has explained this morning what happened when Rishi Sunak was asked for the money to fix the schools? He said no. Not only did he say no, he actually reduced the amount that had previously been available. Do you know what he did have the money for? I don't know if you remember this. I don't know. I mean, this wasn't our money. This wasn't taxpayers' money. This was some of the money that he made by betting against Britain during the financial crisis in 2008. But it meant that he could find about $3 million to give to his old college in America. Rishi Sunak and his wife gave $3 million to the Claremont McKenna computing lab in California, where him and his wife studied. I think she studied economics and French. Fees are about $86,500 a year. So he can find $3 million of his own money for a computer lab at an already lavishly funded college in California. But when charged with looking after British school children and protecting them from falling concrete, answer came there none. Right, that's the politics of it. I have failed in the course of that contemplation to come up with a question about the politics that sort of pops out of the bottom of this conversation. I hope that a question would present itself to me. Was it Building Schools for the Future programme, I think Brett in Huddersfield has called it. So Labour had it in place, the Tories abolished it, and when asked by civil servants for the money to prevent the problems that we're currently suffering from, Rishi Sunak turned around and said no. And the Education Secretary, Gillian Keegan, has essentially gone missing, although I think she'll be required to say something in the House of Commons later today. There's another 1,500 schools or so that still haven't returned their surveys. That's about 10% of English schools. The Daily Mail today is trying to make the story all about Wales, where I'm sure there are also questions to be answered, but not the questions necessarily that the government will be prepared to address. So I've got two questions for you. One is about the state of our schools. We touched on this on Friday. I find it hard to believe, actually, that schools have been allowed to wither in this way. And that will lead us into our second question, which is the political will, or the absence of political will, to fix this stuff. If you are a teacher in particular, it's the busiest day of your year, I know, but not everybody's gone back yet, and you might be on a break. If you're a teacher, how do you rationalise the contempt in which you appear to be held by Conservative governments? How do you, looking at the state of your school, and it doesn't have to be just the concrete. Someone pointed out to me earlier that during the return to school in the midst of COVID, schools were being instructed to open windows, and teachers were reporting that they hadn't been able to open the windows for 8 years because they'd been painted over previously during some sort of cheapskate pound shop refurbishment. I don't know what it's like to be a teacher. I rely on you to tell me what it's like to be a teacher, but I can begin to imagine what it would be like to discover today that the Chancellor, the then Chancellor of the Exchequer, now Prime Minister, personally took the decision to not fix the schools that are now being closed or disrupted because of the risk of this concrete. I don't think anyone can answer the question as to why has it all happened so belatedly. I'd need to have a government minister prepared to talk to me, which sadly hasn't been the case for the best part of a decade. But were that happy day to dawn, the simple question you'd want to ask is how has this happened so belatedly? Why at 8:10 on Sunday night is the Department of Education issuing instructions to schools when they literally open in a few hours? I don't get that. There's three things I don't get this morning. The first is, why have schools been allowed to unravel in this way? 0345 6060 973. And attendant on that, of course, the question of what's it like to be in a school where you can see the physical decline. Question number two, what explains the tardiness? Why are they sending out these messages at 8:10 on a Sunday night when the children are going back to school on Monday morning? I don't know who can answer this. We can just have a speculate if you want. But how can the logistics of that be permitted? The question of Rishi Sunak and the incredibly swift disappearance of his sheen. Do you remember his early sheen when, I think partly through relief even, that the absolute carnage of Boris Johnson's corruption was finally behind us, and then the catastrophic tenure of Liz Truss was swiftly brought to an end, and you thought, well, it can't get any worse. Say what you like about Rishi Sunak, it can't get any worse. And then he talked about professionalism, accountability and integrity, and you thought to yourself, gosh, that's a bit of a sly dig at Johnson, isn't it? Even though he was Chancellor and sat on his hands for most of Boris Johnson's premiership, he's clearly talking about his predecessors when he says we will have professionalism, accountability and integrity, because that is implicitly saying we haven't had it for a while. And then he gave Suella Braverman a job back 3 hours later, and all hopes of improvement or rehabilitation in that area disappeared immediately. But this is really bad, and I don't really get it. Someone comes to you and says, schools are collapsing, potentially. Schools are falling down, potentially. We need money to stop it from happening. And the Chancellor of the Exchequer says, no. I don't really have a question there. I'm just telling you the facts and inviting you to comment on them. How do we account for the crumbling of our schools? How have the Conservatives let it happen? Why has this particular problem been addressed so late in the day? And what do we think about Rishi Sunak's personal and very deliberate refusal to free the funds that were needed to fix the schools that are crumbling?